Over the Po River Valley in northern Italy, March 23, 1945, Captain William "Billy" Faulkner held his P-51 Mustang steady at 8,000 feet, watching the morning mist burn away to reveal the serpentine curve of water below. The bridge at Ostiglia stretched across the river like a grey ribbon, still intact despite weeks of attempts to bring it down. Command had assured the Tuskegee Airmen that this would be a routine reconnaissance mission, nothing more than eyes in the sky to confirm what reconnaissance photographs had already shown. They believed they would circle, report, and return to base in time for lunch. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Captain Faulkner discovered that morning, and what he did in response, would not only sever a critical supply artery for the German armed forces during the war, but would also challenge everything the military establishment believed about the capabilities of the pilots they had once refused to train. Captain Faulkner had joined the Army Air Corps in 1942, part of the experimental program at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. The son of a railroad porter from Detroit, Michigan, he had grown up watching the great locomotives thunder through the city, marveling at the precision and power of American engineering. His father had told him that a black man could aspire to be a porter, perhaps a foreman if he was exceptionally fortunate, but never an engineer. The sky, his father believed, was even further beyond reach. The training at Tuskegee had been deliberately harsh, designed by some to prove the experiment a failure. Faulkner had endured it alongside 331 other men who would eventually earn their wings as the first black military aviators in American history. They had studied aerodynamics and navigation, gunnery and formation flying, all while enduring conditions that would have broken lesser men. The instructors pushed them harder than their white counterparts, demanded more precision, tolerated fewer mistakes. Every error was scrutinized not just as an individual failure, but as evidence that perhaps the entire program was misguided. The physical facilities at Tuskegee were inferior to those at other training bases. The aircraft were older, the maintenance equipment less sophisticated, the housing segregated and substandard. Yet the men who trained there knew that they were fighting for something larger than themselves. They were proving that ability had no connection to the color of one's skin, that excellence could emerge from any background if given the opportunity. When he finally pinned on his silver wings in June 1943, Faulkner had logged more flight hours than most white pilots received before being sent overseas. He had mastered formation, flying in conditions that ranged from perfect visibility to instrument-only navigation through clouds. He had practiced gunnery until he could hit targets at angles and distances that seemed impossible. He had learned to nurse a damaged aircraft back to base, to navigate by dead reckoning when instruments failed, to make decisions in fractions of seconds that could mean the difference between life and returning home safely. By March 1945, Faulkner had flown 87 combat missions over Europe. His squadron, the 332nd Fighter Group, had earned a reputation that made bomber crews specifically request their escort. Not a single bomber under their protection had been lost to enemy fighters, a record unmatched by any other fighter group in the theater. The red-tailed Mustangs had become a symbol of safety in the deadly skies over Europe. The reputation had been hard-won. In their early missions, some bomber crews had been skeptical when they saw the red tails approaching. They had been conditioned by years of prejudice to doubt the capabilities of black pilots. But after a few missions, after watching the red tails fend off attacks with skill and determination, after arriving safely at their targets and returning home intact, the skepticism had transformed into trust and then into active preference. By early 1945, bomber groups would specifically request the 332nd for their most dangerous missions. But on this morning, Faulkner was not escorting bombers. His mission was reconnaissance, flying with his wingman, Second Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a 22-year-old from Atlanta who had once dreamed of becoming an architect. Webb's aircraft rode 300 yards off Faulkner's right wing, maintaining perfect formation as they descended toward the Po Valley. The valley stretched below them in shades of green and brown, checkered with farms and small villages that had somehow survived 3 years of conflict in this region. The Po River itself wound through the landscape, swollen with early spring runoff from the Alps. Snow still capped the distant peaks, brilliant white against the blue sky, a reminder that winter had only recently loosened its grip on northern Italy. And spanning that river, the Ostiglia Bridge carried the primary supply route from Germany through Austria and into northern Italy, feeding the forces that still held the Gothic line against the Allied advance. The bridge was a lifeline, essential for maintaining the defensive positions that had stalled the Allied advance for months. Without it, the German military of that era would be forced to rely on longer, more vulnerable supply routes that would stretch their already strained logistics to the breaking point. Through his headset, Faulkner heard Webb's voice, young and steady despite the tension that always accompanied combat missions. "Captain, I count at least 30 vehicles backed up on the north approach. Looks like a major convoy waiting to cross." Faulkner adjusted his goggles and looked down through the canopy, his eyes scanning the scene with the practiced efficiency of a pilot who had learned to process vast amounts of visual information in seconds. Webb was right. The bridge approach on the German-controlled northern bank was crowded with trucks, their canvas covers painted in the mottled camouflage pattern of the German military of that era. He could see soldiers moving between the vehicles, small as ants from this altitude. Some were smoking, others checking equipment, all of them probably grateful for the delay that gave them a few more moments before crossing into the more dangerous southern territory. The bridge itself appeared undamaged, its steel trusses gleaming in the morning sun. It was a functional structure, built for utility rather than elegance, but impressive nonetheless in its solid, purposeful design. The roadway was wide enough for a single vehicle with minimal clearance on either side, and the span crossed the river in 3 sections supported by concrete piers that rose from the water like thick grey pillars. This was the 4th bridge at this location. Allied bombers had destroyed the previous 3 with high-altitude attacks, each time forcing German engineering units to construct replacements. The current structure had been completed just 8 days earlier, built with remarkable speed, using prefabricated components that had been manufactured elsewhere and transported to the site for assembly. Intelligence reports indicated that the German armed forces during the war had prioritized this crossing point above almost all others in the region, recognizing it as essential for maintaining their defensive positions to the south. The investment of resources in maintaining this crossing was substantial. Each time a bridge was destroyed, engineering units had to mobilize, transport materials, and work around the clock under threat of air attack to restore the crossing. The fact that they kept rebuilding demonstrated how critical this supply line was to their defensive strategy. Confirmed, Faulkner replied into his radio. "Circle around. Let's get a count and some photographs." They banked left in unison, their Mustangs responding with the smooth precision of aircraft that had been meticulously maintained by ground crews who took enormous pride in their work. The P-51 was a masterpiece of American industrial might, powered by a Packard-built Merlin engine, producing 1,490 horsepower. It could reach speeds of 437 miles per hour and climb to 41,000 feet. With its sleek lines and powerful engine, it was faster and more maneuverable than virtually any fighter the German air forces could field by this stage of the conflict. Faulkner loved everything about the aircraft. He loved the way it responded to his touch on the controls, the powerful roar of the engine, the visibility from the bubble canopy that gave him an unobstructed view in almost every direction. He loved the feeling of power and control it provided, the sense that he was flying the finest fighter aircraft in the world. The only thing he didn't love was the nickname some white pilots used when referring to the Mustangs flown by Tuskegee Airmen, calling them maids' planes, a cruel joke that the black pilots had learned to ignore. They understood that the mockery came from men who couldn't accept that they might be equals or even superiors in the air, and they had learned long ago that the best response was simply to continue demonstrating excellence. As they completed their circle, Faulkner activated the camera mounted in his aircraft's fuselage. The K-24 camera would capture overlapping images that intelligence officers could study back at base, analyzing the convoy's composition, counting vehicles, identifying unit markings, and assessing the overall situation. The photographs would be developed within hours of their return, providing crucial intelligence for planning future operations. But even as he followed procedure, something about the scene below troubled him. The convoy was too large, too exposed. German forces had learned long ago not to mass vehicles in daylight where Allied aircraft could find them. The standard practice was to move in small groups, dispersed along the route, making themselves difficult targets. Either this was a mistake born of desperation, a commander who had no choice but to move supplies regardless of the risk, or something else was happening. Perhaps they were confident that the bridge would allow them to cross quickly before any strike could be organized. Perhaps they believed that the reconnaissance flights would simply observe and report, giving them time to complete the crossing before bombers could be scrambled and routed to the target. Perhaps they were simply desperate, facing supply shortages that made the risk worthwhile. "Captain," Webb's voice came through again, breaking Faulkner's thoughts. "Notice anything odd about that bridge?" Faulkner looked more carefully, his pilot's eye scanning the structure for anything unusual. The bridge appeared solid enough at first glance, its steel spans resting on concrete piers that rose from the river. But Webb had an architect's eye for structure, trained to see proportions and relationships that others might miss, and Faulkner trusted his observations implicitly. "Talk to me, Marcus. The piers, sir, they look too thin for the span length. And see how the center section sits. It's not quite level with the approaches. There's a sag, maybe 6 inches, maybe more. That's not right for a properly engineered structure." Faulkner dropped lower, bringing his Mustang down to 5,000 feet, then 4,000, descending in a spiral that kept the bridge in view while maintaining speed and altitude sufficient to evade ground-based threats. At this altitude, he could see more detail, could make out individual rivets and bolts, could observe the way shadows fell across the structure's components. Webb was right. The bridge had a peculiar appearance, as if it had been assembled in haste with whatever materials were available, rather than constructed according to proper engineering principles. The center span sagged slightly, barely noticeable, but definitely present to a trained eye. The supporting piers were narrower than engineering principles would dictate for a structure expected to carry heavy military vehicles. The steel components appeared to be of varying ages, some weathered and rust-stained, others newer and shinier, suggesting that the bridge had been assembled from salvaged parts. The German regime of that era was known for its engineering excellence, its meticulous attention to detail, its ability to design and construct structures that combined efficiency with durability. But by March 1945, that reputation was facing the reality of depleted resources and desperate improvisation. The factories that once produced high-quality steel were now struggling with labor shortages and material scarcity. The engineering units that once built bridges to last decades were now focused on building bridges that would function just long enough to serve their immediate purpose. This bridge was not built to last. It was built to function, to serve its purpose for weeks or perhaps months, allowing supplies and equipment to flow south while the defensive positions held. After that, whether it stood or fell was irrelevant, because the front lines would have moved. Faulkner's mind raced through possibilities, calculating, assessing, weighing options. If the bridge was structurally compromised, bombing it might not even be necessary. A properly applied stress at the right point might be sufficient to trigger a collapse. But standard procedure required him to report his observations and return to base. Command would then plan an appropriate response, probably a bomber mission that would come in at 20,000 feet and drop tons of explosives in the general vicinity, hoping for a direct hit. The problem with that approach was time and resources. Organizing a bombing mission required coordination across multiple units. Bombers had to be loaded with ordnance, flight plans had to be filed and approved, fighter escorts had to be arranged, weather conditions had to be assessed. The entire process could take hours, even a full day. During that time, the convoy would cross, delivering its supplies to forces that would use them to continue fighting, to hold their positions longer, to take Allied lives. And there was no guarantee of success. High-altitude bombing was notoriously imprecise. Even with the best bombardiers using the most sophisticated bomb sights, hitting a target as relatively small as a bridge was difficult. More often than not, the bombs would fall in the river or on the banks, cratering the approaches but leaving the bridge itself functional. "Captain, we should probably head back," Webb suggested, his voice carrying a hint of concern. We've got good photographs. Command will want to see these. Faulkner didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about something he had witnessed 3 months earlier during a mission over Yugoslavia. A German railway bridge, damaged by previous attacks, had collapsed under the weight of a locomotive. Not from explosives, but simply from structural failure, when the load exceeded what the weakened structure could bear. The locomotive had weighed approximately 130 tons, a massive load concentrated on the rails. A loaded military truck weighed about 6 tons, far less than a locomotive. But what if multiple trucks were on the bridge simultaneously? What if the structure was already operating near its stress limits? What if a sudden, unexpected force could push it beyond those limits? The turbulence generated by a low-flying aircraft could be substantial. The prop wash from a Mustang's propeller moved air at tremendous velocity, creating forces strong enough to flip over light vehicles or knock down a person standing too close. If that prop wash struck a weakened bridge structure, particularly if it was channeled and concentrated by passing through the bridge's framework itself, the effect might be sufficient to trigger a collapse. It was a wild idea, unconventional to the point of being potentially reckless, but it was also, Faulkner calculated, theoretically possible. He keyed his radio to the command frequency, his decision crystallizing even as he made the call. Falcon Leader to base. Come in, base. Static crackled for a moment, then a voice responded from Ramitelli Airfield, over 100 miles to the south. Base to Falcon Leader. Go ahead. Falcon Leader reporting reconnaissance complete. Heavy convoy at target location. Approximately 30 vehicles. Bridge shows signs of structural compromise. Request permission to attempt unconventional denial approach. There was a long pause, longer than the normal radio delay. Faulkner could imagine the scene at the operations room back at Ramitelli Airfield. Officers would be looking at maps, conferring in quick, urgent tones, trying to understand what he was proposing without his having to explain it over an unsecured radio frequency. The request was unusual, deliberately vague, because Faulkner himself was still formulating the plan even as he made the request. Finally, the radio came alive again, but the voice was different now, more senior, carrying the weight of command authority. Falcon Leader, this is Colonel Davis. Explain your approach. Faulkner took a breath, organizing his thoughts. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. commanded the 332nd Fighter Group and was the highest-ranking black officer in the Army Air Corps. He was also a man who understood both the capabilities and the constraints his pilots faced, who had fought his own battles against prejudice and discrimination, who had proven through his own excellence that leadership had nothing to do with the color of one's skin. If anyone would authorize an unconventional approach, it would be Davis. But he would also demand a clear explanation, a reasonable assessment of the risks and potential benefits. Sir, Faulkner began, choosing his words carefully, bridge appears to be structurally marginal. Heavy vehicles are massing on the north approach. If we can block the bridge at its weakest point, the convoy might be trapped on the north side. I believe a low-altitude precision approach might accomplish this without expending ordnance. Another pause, shorter this time, but weighted with consideration. Falcon Leader. You're proposing what exactly? Faulkner looked at the bridge again, at the vehicles waiting to cross, at the soldiers moving about unaware that their fate was being decided 8,000 feet above them. He thought about his training, about the hundreds of hours he had spent mastering precision flying, about the instructors who had pushed him to levels of skill that seemed impossible at the time. Sir, a precision flight-through of the bridge structure itself, the turbulence and forces generated, could compromise the center span if it's as weak as it appears. The wake turbulence alone might be sufficient to trigger structural failure. The silence that followed lasted nearly 15 seconds, an eternity in combat communications. Faulkner maintained his orbit, maintaining visual contact with the bridge, waiting for a response that would either authorize his plan or order him home. When Davis spoke again, his voice was measured, careful, carrying the weight of a commander who understood that every decision could have consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Falcon Leader, you're describing an extremely dangerous maneuver, with uncertain probability of success and significant probability of aircraft loss. The clearances are minimal. The risks are substantial. I cannot authorize that approach. Return to base for debriefing. Faulkner felt something tighten in his chest, a mixture of frustration and understanding. He understood the decision. Davis had to think about the broader mission, the political implications, the fact that every Tuskegee pilot lost would be used as evidence by those who still believed the program was a mistake. The loss of an aircraft and pilot in a failed attempt at an unconventional maneuver would be cited as proof that black pilots were reckless, undisciplined, unable to follow proper procedures. But he also knew what would happen if that convoy crossed. Those supplies would reach the front lines. They would enable continued resistance. Allied soldiers would face better-equipped opponents. More lives would be lost. More time would pass before the conflict could finally end. "Understood, sir," Faulkner replied, his voice steadied despite his internal conflict, Falcon leader returning to base. He began to climb, banking away from the bridge, preparing to set course for Ramitelli. Webb formed up on his wing, and for several minutes they flew in silence, gaining altitude and heading south toward home. Below them, the convoy began to move. The lead trucks were approaching the bridge, preparing to cross in single file as military procedure dictated for structures of uncertain capacity. Faulkner watched them, his mind refusing to let go of the problem. He had been trained to follow orders, to fly in formation, to do exactly what was expected and nothing more. The entire Tuskegee program existed under a microscope, every action scrutinized for evidence of failure or success. One mistake, one deviation from protocol could be used to justify ending the program entirely, could undo everything that hundreds of men had worked so hard to achieve. But he had also been trained to think, to adapt, to find solutions where none seemed to exist. His instructor at Tuskegee, a white officer named Captain Morton, who had volunteered for the assignment against the advice of his peers, had told him something during a particularly difficult training flight that had stayed with him through all the missions that followed. "Faulkner," Captain Morton had said, "the book teaches you how to fly correctly. Experience teaches you when the book doesn't apply. The trick is knowing the difference. You'll face situations where the right decision isn't in any manual, where you'll have to trust your training and your judgment and make a choice that could go either way. Those are the moments that define a pilot." This was one of those moments. "Captain," Webb's voice broke the silence, tentative but curious. "What are you thinking?" Faulkner checked his fuel gauge. They had enough for another 30 minutes of flight time before they absolutely had to turn for home. The bridge lay below them, the convoy now beginning its crossing. The first truck rolled onto the approach, its tires singing against the metal surface, the driver probably nervous about the crossing, aware that the bridge was new and untested. "Marcus," Faulkner said slowly, measuring each word, "I want you to do exactly as I say. Climb to 10,000 feet and maintain a holding pattern. If I go down, you mark my position and get back to base, understood?" There was a brief hesitation, a moment of silence that spoke volumes about the understanding between them. Then Webb replied, his voice tight. "Captain, you just told the colonel you were returning to base. I told him I understood his decision. I didn't say I agreed with it. Sometimes a pilot has to make choices that go beyond orders, that rely on judgment and circumstance, rather than predetermined protocols." "Sir," Webb said after another pause, "they'll court-martial you. You know that, right? Disobeying a direct order from your commanding officer, taking unauthorized action, risking government property without approval. They'll throw every regulation in the book at you." "Probably," Faulkner acknowledged, "but if I'm wrong, if this doesn't work, or if I misjudge the clearances, I'll be too busy dealing with the immediate consequences to worry about a court-martial. And if I'm right, if this works, then maybe the results will speak louder than the violation of procedure." He could hear Webb's breathing over the radio, rapid and uncertain, the young pilot processing the implications of what his captain was proposing. Then quietly, in a voice that carried both respect and concern, Webb spoke again. "Sir, if you're going through that bridge, you shouldn't do it alone. 2 aircraft create more turbulence than 1. The effect would be magnified." It was a generous offer, one that spoke to the bond between pilots who had trained together, fought together, trusted each other with their lives. But Faulkner couldn't accept it. One pilot, taking an unauthorized action, was a disciplinary matter that could potentially be managed or mitigated. Two pilots doing so would be evidence of a systemic problem, would be used to argue that the entire program lacked discipline and proper military bearing. "Negative, Lieutenant," Faulkner said firmly. "That's an order. Get to altitude and stay there. What happens next is on me alone. You follow proper procedures, you document everything you see, and you get back to base safely. That's your mission now." This time, Webb didn't argue. "Roger that, Captain. Good luck, sir. And for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing." Faulkner watched his wingman climb away, the red tail of Webb's Mustang brilliant against the blue sky, ascending toward safety and proper procedure while he descended toward a decision that would either be vindicated by success or condemned by failure. Then he turned his attention back to the bridge, back to the problem that his mind had already committed to solving. 3 trucks had crossed now, moving slowly but steadily across the span. The convoy commander was being appropriately cautious, allowing adequate spacing between vehicles to avoid overloading the structure. At this rate, the entire convoy would cross in perhaps 90 minutes, and the supply line would remain intact, and the opportunity would be lost. He pushed the stick forward and descended rapidly, losing altitude in a controlled dive that brought him from 8,000 feet down to 2,000 in a matter of seconds. The Mustang responded eagerly, built for speed and maneuverability, its frame solid and reliable under the stress of rapid descent. At 1,000 feet, he leveled off briefly, checking his instruments, verifying that everything was functioning properly, that the engine was running smoothly, that the controls responded crisply to his inputs. Then he dropped lower still, descending to 500 feet above the river, following the water's course upstream toward the bridge. His airspeed read 220 miles per hour, fast enough to maintain control and generate substantial prop wash, but slow enough to give him some chance to maneuver in the confined space between the bridge's support structures. The Mustang's Merlin engine roared as he advanced the throttle slightly, the sound echoing off the water below. He adjusted his altitude to 150 feet above the water surface, a height that felt both impossibly low and still too high for what he was attempting. From this perspective, the river seemed wider, the bridge larger, the entire scene more immediate and real than it had appeared from altitude. He could see details now that had been invisible from above. He could see the slight shimmer of heat rising from the truck's engines, could make out individual soldiers standing on the banks, could observe the way the bridge's shadow fell across the water in a pattern of light and dark. He could see birds wheeling in the air, disturbed by his aircraft's passage, and he could see fish breaking the surface of the river, unaware of the human drama unfolding above them. The mathematical precision required for what he was attempting bordered on the impossible, existed at the very edge of what his training and the aircraft's capabilities could achieve. The bridge's vertical clearance was approximately 40 feet from the water surface to the bottom of the center span. The P-51 Mustang had a height of 13 feet 6 inches with its landing gear retracted. That left a theoretical margin of 26 feet 6 inches, assuming he flew perfectly level, accounting for the span's sag, assuming no sudden wind gusts, assuming perfect conditions that rarely existed in real-world flying. But the horizontal clearance was even more critical. The bridge's usable width between its main support trusses was approximately 52 feet at the center span. The Mustang had a wingspan of 37 feet. That left less than 8 feet of clearance on each side, a margin that required absolute precision in lateral control, that allowed no drift, no overcorrection, no hesitation. Faulkner's hands on the controls were steady, trained through hundreds of hours of practice, to make the minute adjustments that kept an aircraft perfectly balanced. But his heart hammered against his ribs, his breathing came faster, and he could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool air at altitude. He had trained for precision flying, had threaded his aircraft through mountain valleys and beneath low cloud decks, but this was different. This was threading a needle at 200 miles per hour, with less than 4 feet of clearance on either side and above, with steel structures waiting to tear his aircraft apart if he misjudged by even a small margin. 200 yards from the bridge, he made his final adjustments. The stick felt alive in his hands, every micro-movement translating into subtle shifts in the aircraft's attitude. The rudder pedals beneath his feet balanced the Mustang's tendency to drift slightly left, a characteristic of the torque from that massive propeller spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. His eyes focused on the center of the gap. On the point, he needed to reach and pass through in approximately 3 seconds, on the sliver of space that represented the difference between success and catastrophe. 150 yards. His scan moved constantly between the gap ahead, his instruments and his peripheral vision, processing information faster than conscious thought, relying on training and instinct to maintain perfect control. 100 yards. The bridge filled his vision now, growing larger with each fraction of a second. He could see soldiers on the deck scattering, having finally noticed the red-tailed Mustang screaming toward them at an impossible altitude, their survival instincts overriding training and discipline. A truck halfway across the span jerked to a stop, its driver's foot slamming on the brake as he saw the aircraft approaching at deck level. 75 yards. The opening looked impossibly small now, a slot barely wider than his wings, with that massive steel framework above waiting to smash his canopy if he climbed even a few feet too high. 50 yards. Faulkner's world narrowed to the gap, to the controls, to the perfect balance required. Every sense heightened. He could hear the engines roar even through his leather helmet, could feel the slight vibration through the stick, could smell the faint scent of hydraulic fluid and aviation fuel that permeated every cockpit, could taste the metallic tang of adrenaline in his mouth. 25 yards. He committed, accepting that there was no longer any possibility of pulling up or aborting. The gap rushed toward him, grey steel and dark shadows, the river flashing silver beneath his wings, the entire world compressing down to this single moment of passage. Then he was in it, surrounded by the bridge structure, steel girders whipping past his wingtips with less than 6 feet of clearance on each side. The sound changed, became a sharp metallic howl as the Mustang's prop wash hammered against the bridge's framework with tremendous force. The entire structure shuddered, visible even in that fraction of a second, the steel members flexing under the sudden, unexpected load. Above him, no more than 12 feet from his canopy, the underside of the roadbed flashed past in a blur of rivets and rust and welded joints. The turbulence was violent, immediate, more intense than he had anticipated. The aircraft bucked and shook as the air compressed and rebounded within the confined space, creating forces that pushed against the control surfaces and tested the structural integrity of both aircraft and bridge. For an instant that felt like an eternity. Faulkner fought the controls, making constant corrections to keep the Mustang centered, level, moving forward through the maelstrom of disturbed air. And then he was through, bursting into open air on the north side, climbing hard and fast, his hands shaking on the controls from the adrenaline that now flooded his system. He had made it, against probability, against orders, against every reasonable assessment of the risk. He had threaded his aircraft through the bridge and emerged intact. The Mustang climbed smoothly, the engine still running strong, the controls responding normally. No apparent damage from that violent passage. He keyed his radio, his voice tight with the aftermath of extreme stress. Marcus, status. Webb responded immediately, relief and amazement evident in his tone. Still here, Captain, still breathing. That was the most insane thing I've ever witnessed. I thought for certain you were going into the river. Faulkner didn't reply immediately. He was banking around, climbing to a safer altitude, preparing to see what effect, if any, his passage had created. The bridge was still standing, its structure still superficially intact. For a moment, he thought he had failed, that the entire risk had been for nothing, that he had gambled his career and potentially his life on a theory that hadn't panned out. Then he heard Webb's voice again, but different now, urgent and amazed, almost shouting into the radio. "Captain, Captain, look at the center span, look at the center span." Faulkner turned his Mustang and looked down at what he had done. The bridge's center section, already weakened by hasty construction and insufficient materials, operating at the limits of its load-bearing capacity, had been pushed beyond those limits by the violent turbulence of the Mustang's passage. The sag that he and Webb had noticed earlier had deepened dramatically, visibly increased from even this altitude. As he watched, unable to look away, the roadbed began to twist, metal groaning in protest against forces it had never been designed to withstand. The truck that had stopped on the span started to slide sideways as the surface tilted, its tires losing traction on the increasingly angled roadway. The German soldiers on the bridge understood what was happening before their officers did. Training and discipline vanished, replaced by the most basic human instinct for survival. They abandoned their vehicles and ran, some toward the north bank, others toward the south, racing against the structural failure that now accelerated with each passing second. Some made it to solid ground. Others were still on the span when the inevitable occurred. The supporting cables began to snap, each failure adding stress to those that remained, creating a cascade of destruction that could no longer be stopped or slowed. The sound must have been tremendous, though Faulkner could hear nothing over his own engine. Metal screamed against metal as the bridge tore itself apart, rivets popping like gunfire, welds failing under loads they had never been designed to bear, the entire structure surrendering to forces that overwhelmed its capacity to resist. The center span held for another 10 seconds, a final testament to German engineering even in desperate circumstances, even built from salvaged materials and assembled in haste. Then, almost gracefully considering the violence of the failure, it folded downward, the metal framework collapsing into the river with a massive splash that sent spray high into the air, creating waves that rolled outward to lap against the banks. The truck that had been stopped on the span went with it, tumbling into the Po River along with several tons of twisted steel, its driver presumably having escaped in those final seconds before the collapse. The vehicle hit the water and disappeared beneath the surface, then bobbed up again, floating for a moment before the current began to push it downstream. The northern and southern sections of the bridge remained standing, but they now led nowhere, terminating in jagged edges above the water like broken teeth. The convoy on the north bank was completely cut off, with no way to cross, no way to deliver the supplies that were so desperately needed by forces to the south. The vehicles on the south bank, already having made the crossing, were similarly stranded, unable to return north, isolated from their parent units. Faulkner circled the scene, documenting with his camera what he had accomplished. Below, German soldiers milled about in confusion, their ordered world suddenly disrupted. Some were organizing efforts to rescue anyone who had fallen into the river with the bridge section, showing the professionalism and discipline that characterized the military forces of that era, regardless of nationality. Others were already moving away from the convoy, recognizing that the massed vehicles would be vulnerable to air attack now that they couldn't disperse, knowing that their position was untenable. Officers could be seen gesturing, organizing, attempting to impose order on chaos. Some soldiers were beginning to destroy equipment that couldn't be moved, ensuring it wouldn't fall into Allied hands. Others were preparing vehicles to make the long detour to the next crossing point, a journey that would take days and consume precious fuel. "Falcon leader to Lieutenant Webb," Faulkner called, his voice steadier now. "Get those photographs. Make sure we have complete documentation of the results." "Roger that, Captain," Webb replied, already on it, multiple angles before and after. "The intelligence officers are going to have plenty to work with." They circled for another 5 minutes, watching as the reality of the situation became clear to the forces below. Without the bridge, the convoy was effectively trapped, its mission failed, its supplies out of reach of the forces that needed them. The nearest alternative crossing point was 40 miles upstream, and the roads were poor, muddy from spring rains, barely passable for heavy vehicles. The trucks would take days to reroute, if they could move at all with the fuel they had available. More likely, they would have to be abandoned, their supplies distributed to local units or destroyed to prevent capture by advancing Allied forces. Faulkner finally turned his Mustang south and set course for Ramitelli Airfield. Webb formed up on his wing, and they flew in silence for several minutes, each processing what had just occurred. The adrenaline was wearing off now, replaced by a heavy awareness of what Faulkner had done and the consequences that would follow. He had disobeyed a direct order from his commanding officer. He had performed a maneuver so dangerous that it violated every flight safety protocol ever written, that could have easily resulted in his own demise and the loss of an expensive aircraft. He had risked not just his own career, but potentially the reputation of the entire Tuskegee program on a gamble that could easily have ended in disaster. But he had also severed a critical supply line, trapped a major convoy, and accomplished what weeks of conventional bombing had failed to achieve, all without expending a single round of ammunition, without losing a single aircraft, with a maneuver that had taken less than 5 seconds from entry to exit. The question was whether his superiors would see it the same way, whether the results would justify the methods, whether success would outweigh the breach of discipline and protocol. Ramitelli Airfield appeared ahead after 40 minutes of flight, its runway cutting through the Italian countryside like a scar, surrounded by the tents and buildings that housed the 332nd Fighter Group. Faulkner lowered his landing gear and began his approach, noting that the entire base seemed to be watching, that an unusual number of people were gathered near the flight line. Word had obviously spread, carried by radio communications that dozens of people monitored, amplified by speculation and rumor. The control tower cleared him to land with no unnecessary communication, and he brought the Mustang down smoothly, its tires chirping against the concrete runway, the aircraft rolling to a stop in front of the operations building, where a group of officers waited. When he climbed out of the cockpit, Colonel Davis was waiting on the tarmac, his expression unreadable, his posture that of a commander who had important business to conduct. Behind him stood Major Roberts, the operations officer, and Captain Morton, Faulkner's old instructor from Tuskegee, who now served as the squadron's training officer. Their faces were equally difficult to read, professional masks that revealed nothing about what they were thinking. "Captain Faulkner," Davis said formally, his voice carrying clearly in the relative quiet of the flight line. "Come with me, please." They walked to the operations building in silence, followed by curious stares from ground crew and other pilots who understood that something significant had occurred, but didn't yet know the details. Inside, Davis led him to a small office and closed the door, creating a private space for a conversation that would determine Faulkner's immediate future. For a long moment, the colonel simply looked at him, his dark eyes impossible to read, his expression neutral. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable, but Faulkner maintained his composure, standing at attention, waiting for whatever was coming. Then Davis spoke, his voice quiet but firm, carrying the weight of command authority and personal disappointment. "When I give an order, Captain, I expect it to be followed. I don't expect my pilots to interpret it, modify it, or decide independently whether it serves their purposes. I expect immediate compliance, proper military discipline, and respect for the chain of command. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Faulkner replied. "That said," Davis continued, his expression softening slightly but his tone remaining serious, "what you did today was either brilliant or insane, and I'm not entirely certain which. Perhaps both. Perhaps something in between that doesn't have a clear category. The reconnaissance photographs show the bridge is completely impassable, the convoy is trapped, and our ground forces are already moving to capitalize on the situation. By tomorrow morning, we'll have captured or destroyed every vehicle in that convoy without having to conduct any additional air operations." Faulkner remained silent, unsure how to respond, unwilling to offer excuses or justifications until he understood where this conversation was heading. Davis walked to the window and looked out at the airfield, at the Mustangs being serviced by ground crews, at the pilots walking between buildings, at the familiar routine of a combat unit between missions. "You put me in an impossible position, Billy," he said quietly. "If you had failed, if you had gone into that river, if that bridge had been stronger than you calculated, I would have had to explain to General Eaker and everyone above him why I allowed one of my pilots to attempt such a reckless maneuver. The political consequences for this program would have been severe, possibly fatal to our continued operations. Every critic who believes this program was a mistake would have pointed to your failure as proof that black pilots lack the judgment and discipline required for combat operations. I understand, sir. I take full responsibility for my decision and my actions." The colonel turned back to face him, his expression complex, showing multiple emotions simultaneously. "The problem is that you succeeded spectacularly, which means I now have to explain why this program produces pilots who are capable of thinking independently, of finding unconventional solutions, of taking calculated risks that sometimes pay off in dramatic fashion. You've just made it much harder for anyone to argue that you and your fellow pilots are anything less than exceptional, that you don't deserve every opportunity that any other pilot receives. There was a knock on the door, and Captain Morton entered carrying a folder, his expression professionally neutral. "Sir, the photo analysis is complete. The bridge is confirmed destroyed beyond any possibility of rapid repair. The convoy is immobilized, with no viable alternative route available in the time frame required. Intelligence estimates we've prevented approximately 200 tons of supplies from reaching the front lines, including ammunition, medical supplies, and spare parts that were critically needed by enemy forces." Davis took the folder and reviewed it briefly, his eyes scanning the typed report and the attached photographs that showed the bridge before and after Faulkner's passage. "Thank you, Captain. That will be all for now." After Morton left, closing the door behind him, Davis sat down behind his desk and gestured for Faulkner to take a seat as well, a subtle shift from formal military interaction to something more personal, more candid. "Tell me, Billy," he said, using the familiar name rather than rank, "what made you think you could thread that needle? What calculation or confidence led you to believe that the risk was justified?" Faulkner considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer mattered, that Davis was trying to understand not just what had happened, but why, trying to assess whether this had been calculated risk or reckless gambling. "Sir, during training, you taught us that the Mustang is the finest fighter aircraft in the world, and you taught us to understand its capabilities thoroughly. You taught us that we had to be better than everyone else, not just to prove ourselves, but to survive in an environment where we would receive less support and less benefit of any doubt. And you taught us that sometimes the right decision isn't the safe decision. That combat requires judgment that goes beyond following procedures." Davis nodded slowly, absorbing the response. "I did teach you all of that," he acknowledged. "I just didn't expect you to take it quite so literally, to apply those lessons in quite so dramatic a fashion." He paused, then continued in a more official tone. "There's going to be a formal inquiry, Billy. I can't avoid that. The mission report will go up through channels, and some staff officer somewhere is going to have questions about why one of my pilots deliberately flew through a bridge structure in apparent defiance of a direct order. Be prepared to answer those questions honestly and completely." "Yes, sir, I understand." "However," Davis added with the faintest hint of a smile, "I suspect those questions will be tempered somewhat by the results you achieved. The Army likes success, especially when it comes without casualties or significant resource expenditure. You may find yourself uncomfortable, famous for a while, celebrated for a deed that also violated regulations. Welcome to the complicated nature of military achievement." Over the next 3 weeks, the story of the bridge flight spread through the Allied forces in Italy like wildfire through dry grass. Bomber crews told it to fighter pilots, who told it to ground forces, who told it to support personnel, and each telling added embellishments and exaggerations. The details changed with each retelling, became larger than life, grew beyond the bounds of what had actually occurred. In some versions, Faulkner flew through the bridge upside down, a physical impossibility given the clearances, but a detail that made the story more dramatic. In others, he did it twice, once to assess and once to execute, doubling the courage required. One particularly creative account had him flying through while being pursued by enemy fighters, though no such fighters had been present or even possible, given the air superiority that Allied forces enjoyed by that stage of the conflict. The official inquiry was conducted 2 weeks later by a board of 3 senior officers who had been assigned to review the incident and determine whether disciplinary action was warranted. They interviewed Faulkner for 2 hours, asking detailed questions about his decision-making process, his assessment of the risks, his understanding of military discipline, and his reasons for proceeding despite having received a direct order to return to base. Faulkner answered honestly, acknowledging that he had disobeyed a direct order, but explaining the reasoning that had led to that decision. He described his assessment of the bridge's structural weakness, his calculation of the clearances required, his judgment that the potential benefit outweighed the risks involved. He neither minimized what he had done nor attempted to justify it through special pleading, simply presenting the facts and accepting whatever consequences the board determined were appropriate. The board's report, declassified decades later when military records became available to historians and researchers, concluded that while Captain Faulkner's actions violated established protocols and military discipline, they demonstrated exceptional piloting skill, tactical innovation, and sound judgment regarding mission priorities. The report recommended no disciplinary action, noting that the successful outcome prevented enemy forces from receiving critical supplies and likely shortened the duration of hostilities in the region. More significantly, the report observed that the incident demonstrated the high caliber of training and capability present in the 332nd Fighter Group, and recommended that similar units be granted increased operational flexibility to utilize their pilots' full range of skills. It was a remarkable conclusion, one that validated not just Faulkner's individual action, but the broader capabilities of the Tuskegee Airmen as a whole. For Faulkner, the most meaningful response came not from the inquiry board or from official commendations, but from his fellow pilots. On the evening after the mission, they gathered in the Enlisted Men's Club at Ramitelli, a cramped building with mismatched furniture scrounged from various sources, and a battered piano that somehow still produced recognizable music. Someone had acquired a bottle of surprisingly good Italian wine, a rarity on a base where supplies were perpetually short and luxuries non-existent. Lieutenant Webb, who had watched the entire event from altitude, told the story with dramatic flair, his hands illustrating the Mustang's path through the bridge structure, his voice rising and falling with the tension of the moment. Other pilots listened, some skeptical until they saw the reconnaissance photographs, others immediately believing because they understood what Faulkner was capable of, all of them understanding the skill and courage required for such a maneuver. Captain Morton, who had taught many of them to fly, who had been there through their struggles and triumphs at Tuskegee, raised his glass in a toast. To Captain Faulkner, he said, who proved today that the impossible is just the possible that hasn't been attempted yet, and to all of you, who prove every day that the limitations others place on us are meaningless when we refuse to accept them, when we insist on demonstrating capability rather than arguing about capability. They drank, and for a while, the conflict seemed distant, held at bay by camaraderie and shared purpose, by the bonds forged through training and combat, by the understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves. But Faulkner himself remained quiet throughout the celebration, his mind already moving beyond the bridge to the larger questions it raised. He had succeeded this time, but the risk had been enormous, the margin for error nearly non-existent. Another pilot attempting a similar maneuver might not be so fortunate, might misjudge the clearances or encounter unexpected conditions or simply have slightly less skill or experience. The line between innovation and recklessness was thin, visible only in retrospect when outcomes were known, and the consequences of crossing it could be fatal, not just for the individual, but for everyone who depended on the reputation of the unit. Later that evening, after the celebration had wound down and most pilots had retired to their quarters, Faulkner found himself alone on the airfield, standing beside his Mustang in the gathering darkness. The ground crew had already patched a few small dents in the fuselage, minor damage from debris kicked up by the prop wash during the bridge passage, testament to how close he had come to disaster. The red tail gleamed in the moonlight, a symbol that had come to mean reliability, excellence, protection for the bombers that flew with their escort. A voice behind him said quietly, "Beautiful aircraft, isn't she?" Faulkner turned to find Colonel Davis approaching, his hands in his pockets, his manner relaxed in a way it rarely was during duty hours, revealing the person behind the rank and responsibility. "Yes, sir," Faulkner replied. "She truly is." Davis ran his hand along the Mustang's wing, feeling the smooth metal, the rivets and seams that held the structure together. The physical reality of American industrial might transformed into a tool of war. "When I was at West Point," he said conversationally, "they told me that black officers would never command white soldiers, that the natural order of things precluded such arrangements. When I applied to flight school, they told me that black men didn't have the temperament for aviation, that we lacked the quick reflexes and spatial reasoning required for piloting. When this program started, they gave us old training aircraft and told us we should be grateful for the opportunity, fully expecting that we would fail and the matter would be settled once and for all." He looked at Faulkner directly, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Every single one of those assumptions has been proven wrong. not because we argued against them or complained about them or petitioned for different treatment, but because we simply went out and did what they said we couldn't do. We flew the missions, protected the bombers, defeated enemy aircraft, and came home safely. Today, you added another chapter to that story, another example of achievement that contradicts prejudice. You did something that most pilots wouldn't have attempted, something that required not just skill but vision to even conceive, and you succeeded where others would have failed. Thank you, sir. That means a great deal coming from you. Don't thank me, Davis replied. Just remember that you're carrying more than yourself when you fly. You're carrying the hopes of everyone who comes after you, everyone who needs proof that ability matters more than prejudice, that excellence can emerge from any background if given the opportunity. It's a heavy burden, and it's not fair that you have to carry it, that your accomplishments are judged not just on their own merits but on what they prove about an entire group of people. But it's the reality we face, and we have to succeed not just for ourselves but for everyone who follows. Faulkner nodded, understanding the weight of those words, accepting the responsibility they represented. I won't forget, sir. None of us will. The conflict in Europe ended 6 weeks later on the 8th of May 1945. The 332nd Fighter Group flew their final combat missions in late April, continuing to provide escort for bombers and ground support for advancing Allied forces until the very end. In total, the Tuskegee Airmen had flown over 15,000 combat sorties, destroyed 262 enemy aircraft, and earned numerous citations for valor and achievement. Captain Faulkner flew 11 more missions before the conflict's end, each one successful, each one executed with the precision and professionalism that characterized his entire service, none quite as spectacular as the bridge flight, but all contributing to the overall mission. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions at Ostiglia, the citation carefully worded to emphasize his innovation and skill while downplaying the element of disobedience that had made it possible. After the conflict ended, Faulkner returned to Detroit, where he used the GI Bill to earn a degree in mechanical engineering. He worked for 23 years at Ford Motor Company, eventually becoming one of the company's first black supervisors in the engineering division, breaking barriers there just as he had done in the military. He married a schoolteacher named Dorothy Matthews, raised 3 children who all attended college, and spoke rarely about his experiences during the conflict, finding that most people were more interested in the mythology of the bridge flight than the reality of what it had meant, more fascinated by the drama than the underlying lessons about judgment and responsibility. Lieutenant Webb also returned home to Atlanta, where he finally pursued his dream of architecture. His firm designed several prominent buildings in the city, including a memorial to the Tuskegee Airmen that featured a stylized representation of a red-tailed Mustang flying through a bridge, immortalizing in metal and stone the moment that had defined both their service and their capabilities. Colonel Davis continued his military career after the conflict, eventually becoming the first black general in the United States Air Force. He spent decades advocating for integration and equal opportunity in the military, using the exemplary record of the Tuskegee Airmen as irrefutable evidence that ability had no connection to race, that excellence was colorblind, that the only relevant factors were training, dedication, and opportunity. The bridge at Ostiglia was rebuilt after the conflict ended, this time by Italian civilian contractors who constructed a modern reinforced concrete structure that still stands today, carrying traffic across the Po River as part of the regional transportation network. A small plaque on the northern approach, placed there in 1968 after historians researched the site's significance, commemorates the original bridge's destruction, though it attributes the event to Allied air operations without mentioning the specific circumstances or the individual pilot responsible. In 1972, Faulkner was invited to return to Italy as part of a veterans group tour organized to revisit the sites where they had served. He stood on the rebuilt bridge, looking down at the Po River flowing peacefully below, and tried to reconcile this quiet scene with the chaos of that March morning 27 years earlier. An Italian guide, unaware of his connection to the site, explained in accented English that the original bridge had been destroyed by American bombers in 1945, a simplification that missed the nuance and complexity of what had actually occurred. Faulkner didn't correct him. The truth was more complicated than a tour guide's narrative could accommodate, and the important thing was not who got credit or how the story was remembered, but what had been accomplished. The bridge had fallen, the convoy had been captured, and the conflict had ended sooner because of countless small actions by countless individuals, most of whom would never be remembered or celebrated or even acknowledged. What stayed with him, decades later, was not the adrenaline of threading his aircraft through that impossible gap, nor the satisfaction of success against overwhelming odds, nor even the recognition he received afterward. It was the responsibility that Colonel Davis had spoken of that evening on the airfield, the weight of representing something larger than himself, the burden of proving through action what others doubted through prejudice. The Tuskegee Airmen had been created as an experiment, born from a combination of political pressure, military necessity, and deep skepticism about whether black Americans could master the complex demands of military aviation. They had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, not through special treatment or lowered standards, but through excellence demanded and excellence delivered, through refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose. Faulkner's bridge flight was a singular moment in that larger story, a perfect example of what could be accomplished when skill met opportunity, when training met innovation, when courage met calculated risk. But it was also a reminder that the barriers they broke were not just about flying, not just about military achievement, but about demonstrating human potential in the face of systematic doubt and institutional prejudice. In his later years after he retired from Ford and had time to reflect on his experiences, Faulkner occasionally spoke to school groups about his service. He would show them photographs of the red-tailed Mustangs, talk about the training at Tuskegee, explain the technical challenges of precision flying and the demands of combat operations. But what he emphasized most was the lesson that Colonel Davis had taught him, that limitations are often artificial, imposed by others' assumptions rather than actual impossibility, that the only way to disprove false limitations is through demonstrated achievement. The students would always ask about the bridge flight, fascinated by the dramatic nature of the story. How did you know you could make it? Were you scared? Would you do it again? His answer varied in details, but remained consistent in theme. I didn't know I could make it, he would say honestly. I knew it was theoretically possible based on the aircraft's dimensions and the bridge's clearance. I knew the potential benefit outweighed the risk based on the intelligence situation. And yes, I was terrified. Fear doesn't disqualify you from doing something necessary. It just means you understand the stakes, that you're taking the challenge seriously. As for doing it again, he would smile slightly and say, once was sufficient for a lifetime. William Faulkner passed away in 2001 at the age of 83, surrounded by family in the same Detroit home he had purchased in 1946 with money saved from his military pay. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his career at Ford, his community service, his role as a founding member of several civic organizations, and his military record, including the Distinguished Flying Cross. It did not mention the bridge flight specifically, but it noted that he had been part of a group of pilots who had changed American military aviation forever and had helped demonstrate that excellence knows no color. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.